All right. So I encourage you guys, feel free to keep throwing your introductions in the chat window, kind of answering that icebreaker question of what's energizing you versus draining you. I can share with you all, I have my first cold in like maybe 2.5 years. I've been masked up for the better part of it. So I think I've escaped cold season for the most part. And definitely that is draining me today. But my work with educators like you all, I find very exciting, energizing. So and hopefully we'll have plenty of energy to get through our session today and kind of tackle this interesting and important topic that we've come here to chat about. So one of the things I want to kind of start by saying is part of this title, I think, is really important to highlight, which is learning across kind of deeper learning across learning environments. And so one of my areas of focus is really just supporting teachers in designing and facilitating learning that can transcend one physical environment. Like after the pandemic, I really wanted teachers to have strategies and skills and models and techniques they could use, whether they were designing learning experiences for a physical classroom, an online learning environment, or a blend of the two. I think what educators really need right now is that flexible skill set. And I wrote a book with Dr. Katie Novak around kind of bringing together universal design for learning and blended learning. And what we start the book by talking about is just that we want educators in today's world that is so unpredictable, whether it's extreme weather, whether it's something like COVID and pandemics, to have a skill set and a mindset and a tool set that is really versatile, that can kind of transcend any learning environment. And we kind of start with the anecdote of the duck boat. So if you've ever been to Massachusetts, you've probably seen these like World War II amphibian vehicles that like roll down the streets and you can kind of sightsee all over Boston, and then they go right into the water, right? You don't need to get out and get into another vehicle. It just floats in the water. And that was kind of what we envisioned for teachers when we think about this work of how do we support educators in thinking through planning and design so that their work with learners can really happen anywhere. And we can design really meaningful learning experiences, whether we're in a physical classroom, students are learning online, or like I said, there's this combination of the two. So I think really for me, that's always my kind of focus, is how do we make this work more nimble so that we can feel more successful no matter where we're working with learners. So today we're going to talk about the planning and design process, and you're going to hear me using the words or the phrase mini units, right? As opposed to some of the longer form units that most of us are probably used to. And the reason we're going to focus on kind of almost like micro learning, bite-sized learning mini units is because they have this advantage of obviously being like smaller in scope, and they tend to help us to avoid kind of cognitive overload for students, right? When we're plowing through a 6 to 8 week unit, it can get a little murky for students in terms of what is the focus, what are the key ideas and skills that we're really trying to hone and develop in such a lengthy unit. And when we start to adjust our scope to more of a focus on mini units, it allows us to keep that cognitive load more manageable for students. It allows for more of that brain-based kind of research around learning, kind of spacing out learning, giving students repeated exposure with concepts and skills. It helps to improve retention, allows us to be a little bit more nimble and flexible so we can make adjustments to a smaller scope mini unit much easier than when we're, 4 weeks into a 6 or 8 week unit traditionally. And it makes allowing for self-paced progress for learners, giving them more opportunities to control the pace of their learning. It allows us to do that more easily, to kind of facilitate that self-paced learning where hopefully it feels more doable. So just to give you a couple examples of what I mean by going from those like long form units that most of us are kind of used to planning. I definitely was. I spent the first 16 years of my career really kind of focused on those long units, and really moving to the mini units. It looks something like what you're seeing on my screen now. So as a former English teacher at the high school level, my units typically followed a text. So we're going to read something like To Kill a Mockingbird. It's going to take us 6 weeks to get through. That's going to be our unit. And when I started to move over to more of a mini unit approach, so I could be more nimble, and when I was working during the pandemic with teachers around trying to plan in a way that was a little more effective for them and not so overwhelming for students, instead of having the unit follow the book, we had the units kind of focus on things like theme, characterization, symbolism. So each one might run 1 to 2 weeks. We might still be reading the text and really using that as our anchor text to talk about theme or to talk about characterization. But the unit itself was focused on the smaller scope topic of theme. Then the next mini unit was focused on the smaller scope topic of characterization, drawing from the novel, drawing from other texts to kind of help students understand what is a theme and how does it develop in a text? What is characterization? Let's talk about the different characters and how are they being described and developed, et cetera. If you think about a big unit on population ecology and breaking it down into its different parts, kind of thinking about covering things like energy flows and population and community dynamics as mini units within that larger umbrella. And same with the history unit that might focus on like the Industrial Revolution. Maybe there's a mini unit on like the causes or lead up to. Maybe there's a mini unit on the impact on the environment or the growth of industry. So again, it's not that we're like abandoning what we used to do. We're kind of taking those big umbrella units and we're thinking about what are the smaller parts and how do we actually create units focused on those smaller parts so that students aren't quite so overwhelmed. So we have the ability to make really clear connections between the different parts of this larger topic. So I wanted to clarify that before we get into this design work, in case you're wondering, why on earth will we be talking about mini units? Why aren't we just talking about traditional units? So as with most design work, I really like to advocate for a backward design. So anybody who is familiar with kind of understanding by design, the work of Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins, it's this idea that we plan in a very specific way so that our learning objectives are totally aligned with our assessment strategy. So we start by often kind of looking at our standards, and from the selected standards we're focusing on, articulating clear learning objectives and desired results. The second part is actually jumping to what sometimes feels like the end of the process, which is then thinking about an assessment strategy. So once we articulate for a mini unit the desired results, the learning objectives, then we want to think about how are we going to measure student progress toward those desired results, toward those learning objectives. We want to make sure those things are totally aligned. Then we get into what I think of as the fun part of design, which is thinking through that learning path, that step 3 of what learning experiences, what instruction, what meaning-making activities are going to help students to progress down a path so they can be successful on that learning or on that assessment and really meet those learning objectives. And part of my work as somebody who's a big fan of blended learning is really thinking about how do we create some flexibility in the pathways that we give students, because we know not all students are going to acquire information the same way, process and make meaning the same way, and really kind of share their learning in the same way. So how do we create that flexibility as we think about that third stage, which is the planning of learning experiences and instruction? So curriculum mapping, which is maybe not the sexiest topic for educators, is a really important part of this, right? Thinking about creating what will essentially be a roadmap for you and your learners. Going through a curriculum mapping process can help us to be really intentional with our design work, which is critical if we're going to thrive in kind of these more flexible teaching and learning landscapes that we seem to be encountering as educators, right? Being tasked with teaching with more technology and being a little bit more nimble. It can also help us to articulate in a unit, we may have always done something before, but what are the true must-dos for our work with students, and what are the may-dos, right? The things that we'd like to do, but we might not get to. We want to know what is absolutely essential, do we think, to move students toward those desired outcomes, those learning objectives. Those are our must-dos. And then the may-dos are the things that we would love to do if we have time, or maybe they're the things we set up our advanced students who need additional challenges to tackle if they're seeming like they're ready for a next level kind of task or learning experience. It encourages teachers to really anchor their design work in target standards and skills and concepts, and aligning those learning objectives with the assessment strategies that we're using. So as we get into the curriculum mapping process, which I'm just going to use as an opportunity to nudge your thinking about design work, we're basically trying to answer questions like, what is it that we want students to learn? When is it being learned? How is learning being measured and assessed? How is information being transferred? And how is meaning being made? And how can we make sure students enjoy agency and meaningful choice in the learning process? And so agency simply is when we give students more meaningful choices about their learning experience. And so you'll hear and you'll see examples in the work I'm going to share with you and the resources I'm going to share with you that are really designed to get students enjoying more agency in terms of their learning experience. So as we get into this kind of curriculum mapping process, really what we're trying to do is make sure our course content and the assignments we're asking students to complete are aligned with the standards at the heart of these mini units, that we're really organizing our mini units and our lessons to kind of follow these logical sequences that are designed to help all students make progress toward firm standard aligned goals. We want to, as much as possible, position the student as the active agent in the learning experience. We want them doing the work, engaging in the conversation, making the meaning. We obviously want them to reflect rigor and depth and breadth, and hopefully provide, as I said, those kind of learning pathways that are a little bit more flexible, allowing students some opportunities to make key choices to figure out which pathway is going to work best for me as a learner. And obviously we want to drive higher order thinking skills and in kind of include some rich media so that students can engage with information in different ways, be that, articles or videos, podcasts, interactive websites. So one of the resources I'm going to share with you just in a moment is this kind of curriculum mapping planning document for mini units. And we're going to walk through it. And I'd like to build in time whenever I work with teachers, just so you guys can kind of consider the strategies we're talking about, capture your thinking, start brainstorming and planning right in these sessions together. So you leave with something you can kind of build on. So in this document, I'll share with you kind of what it looks like. At the top, it has this place for, where you can literally get to each of your units straight from the top of the page, just for easy kind of navigation. Then there's a spot for you to think about, okay, if I'm planning a mini unit, what is the topic, the focus, the subject? So you might even want to think about one of your units you're teaching this second semester, and what is a smaller subsection or subpart or subtopic of that unit that you could start to think about maybe bringing out of that larger unit and creating a mini unit around. I think whenever we anchor this work in actual curriculum and units and topics we have to cover, the more meaningful it will be. Then you'll see a place for anywhere from 1 to 3 kind of target standards. Because these are short form units and they're only lasting usually around 1 to maybe edging into a 3rd week, but usually not. We want to limit the amount of target standards we really want to focus on, so we're not overwhelming ourselves or our students and trying to cover too much in a mini unit. And then from those standards, we articulate learning objectives. These are the things we want students to be able to do, understand, or know at the end of this mini unit. Then, like I said, once we've clarified those, we actually jump to the assessment column and we think about what strategy or strategies might we use to have students demonstrate their learning? How are we going to know how much progress they made to understanding a particular topic, a particular concept, being able to apply a particular strategy or skill? Then we can get into the instruction column and what students might need to hear or learn or see, what activities are going to help them process and make meaning, kind of make sense of all this information. And then what are some of those resources we already kind of are aware of or typically use when we cover this content that we might want to pull into this mini unit. So what I have done for you guys today, because I know these sessions are relatively short and there's a lot of information covered, is I put together a resource document. And so for each section of our work together, you're going to see a collection of links. And so the first one is around the welcome activity. Even though we're in a webinar mode and it kind of limits how much we can chat and share, obviously I always start out with an introduction and an icebreaker. I think it's really important to give students, whether they're adult learners or whether they are, young learners, the opportunity to just connect at the start of any class, be it in person or online. And so I have a collection of kind of these sentence starters that are designed to help build community. So the very first thing, if you click on that link I just put in the chat window, is this kind of conversation starter slide deck, which you can bookmark because it's not going anywhere. And I just continually kind of add discussion starters to this. You'll see the one we started with today. Or you can make a copy of it and add slides to your copy if you prefer. The next section down here is around backward design, and that's where you're going to see your template for the mini unit. So if you open that up, you should be able to just go up to File and make a copy. And so as we're going through our session today, this is where I would love for you to capture your thinking, is in the copy of your kind of mini unit template here. So when we're talking about instruction, I want you to be able to kind of capture your thinking about your instruction and models here. And then if we're, talking about, assessments, what are your initial thoughts about assessments? And you can capture it here. Again, always kind of thinking about what can you take away from an experience like this that then you can share with other people you work with or potentially use kind of indefinitely. So everything we chat about and more is on this resource document for you guys. All right, so we're going to start with learning objectives. So the learning objectives are really what we craft after we've decided what is going to be the topic of our first mini unit. And what are those target standards we really want to focus on as we design this unit? Because those target standards directly inform the learning objectives. We're going to craft our learning objectives from the 1, 2, or 3 target standards we've selected. And just because we only focus on 1 or 2 or even 3 target standards, it doesn't mean that's all we're going to cover, right? As teachers, we end up covering a lot, like hitting a lot of different standards. But when I say target standards, I just mean the ones we really want to focus on for this particular learning experience. So when we think about learning objectives, again, it's answering that question of at the end of this week or at the end of this 2-week mini unit, what do I want students to know, understand, or be able to do? And it's helpful if we use kind of active verbs to describe the learning objectives. We want to make sure the verbs are measurable. There are things like explain, discuss, compare. Keep the wording specific, and I like to keep it really student friendly, so students also can be made clear, like, hey, this is what we want you to be able to do at the end of this unit. This is what you're working toward. That clarity, I think, is really important for them. And then maybe even thinking about, as you're crafting these learning objectives, where are they kind of falling on the Bloom's taxonomy? And do we want to nudge ourselves and our students a little higher with one or more of these learning objectives? objectives for this particular unit. So I've thrown a resource document at you, and what I would love for you to do for this first your turn, and whenever you see a your turn, it just means I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, whether it's 3 or 5 minutes, to do something. So I'd love for you to make a copy of that curriculum mapping document. And if you have any trouble making a copy, just shoot me a note in the chat window. I'm happy to be a resource for you. And then think about this second semester and maybe one of your larger units. If you were going to break it down into a few mini units, what might be a topic, subject, or focus of a mini unit that you would cover second semester? And then from there, you can think about a target standard or two, articulate learning objectives. Keep in mind, we want those learning objectives to be measurable, because the next thing we're going to do is try to figure out how will we assess progress toward these learning objectives. So as you guys are working, I consider this kind of like Tucker time if you need me. So if you have a question, you need a thought partner, you want to brainstorm, you want to run an idea past me, just put it in the chat window. I will mute myself so I'm not distracting you guys as you work. I'll set the timer so you can kind of self-pace. But if you hit any bumps, have any questions, need any support, please don't hesitate to ask. All right, so I'm going to bring you guys back together. If you feel inspired, I would love to have you put in the chat window, just like the topic of the mini unit you were starting to think about. Was there like a subtopic of a larger unit that you were kind of mulling over as you made a copy of the mapping document? Maybe even sharing a learning objective if you feel inspired. I know sometimes in these sessions when you can't be in a breakout room, it's like you think you have an idea, you maybe want some feedback on it, or you want to know if you're on the right track. So I encourage you to use the chat window for that and ask any questions you want, because when you guys get back into the next year turn, I'll go through the chat and just see what you guys shared. I'm happy to give you some feedback or to answer any questions that pop up while I'm kind of moving on to this next section, which is thinking about that connection between the learning objectives and the desired outcomes, right? So it's kind of interesting to go straight from, okay, these are the learning objectives. This is what I want students to know, understand, be able to do. And now I'm thinking about an assessment strategy. But the benefit is that if we articulate the learning objectives and then we get kind of bogged down in all the learning activities we think are important to help them meet those objectives, sometimes it can make the connection between the objectives and the assessment strategy a little bit murky. And maybe our assessment strategy isn't as aligned as it would have been if we go straight from one to the other, learning objectives to perform or to assessment strategy. One of my favorite types of assessments are performance tasks. And I love this quote by Jay McTighe. He says a performance task is any learning activity or assessment that asks students to perform, to demonstrate their knowledge, understanding, or proficiency. Performance tasks yield a tangible product and or performance that serve as evidence of learning. And unlike a select response item like multiple choice or matching type of questions on a traditional exam that ask students to select from given alternatives, a performance task presents a situation and really calls for learners to apply or transfer their learning in context. So kind of thinking about when might it be appropriate to ask students not just to take an exam with those kind of prescribed options, but really to be challenging them with performance tasks, because performance tasks are really designed to get students applying their knowledge and skills, not just retrieving information. And that's a really powerful demonstration of true, deeper learning. They're open-ended, so they're not going to yield one right answer and actually encourage more creativity of thought. They often present novel and authentic contexts for students to work in, making their work feel more interesting often and relevant. They tend to be complex and multifaceted, really challenging different parts of students' thinking and their brains as they're kind of taking what they learned and attempting to transfer it. It really, through that demonstration or through that transfer, they demonstrate deep learning. And often performance tasks will incorporate other subject areas and 21st century skills in the way that traditional assessments might not. And they can be evaluated just like anything else with clear criteria and rubrics. And for anybody who's really interested in rubrics, I just blogged about rubric design yesterday. So my most recent blog on my website is about designing standard aligned rubrics. So performance tasks as assessments can take lots of different forms. Students might demonstrate and create a product that takes the form of like a video or an original podcast. It might be a written kind of response or explanation or report or essay of some kind. They might build a model or construct some kind of simulation, do something more artistic and visual, or like the quote from Jay McTighe says, actually engage in some kind of a performance to demonstrate their learning. Now, one of the things I said early on today was really thinking about flexibility and different pathways. And even when we're talking about assessment, if we have identified the target standards at the start of a mini unit, then those target standards, much like I wrote about in this blog I published yesterday, we're using those standards to create the criteria for the rubric we are going to use to assess the student work. So we should be able to give students some agency and choice around their assessment strategy. So if we want to give them a performance task as a form of authentic assessment, maybe we give them 2 different scenarios to choose from and even 2 different products to create to demonstrate their learning. So they get to make a decision about which scenario are they more drawn to that they want to engage with, and which product are they more excited to generate or create to demonstrate their learning. So I know sometimes when I talk about student agency with teachers, they get a little bit nervous. It's like, wait a second, Catlin, all of this planning and design work, it's really time consuming. And now you're asking me to build in a bunch of meaningful choices, and that feels daunting, which I can totally appreciate given how spread thin most educators are. But I tell teachers, don't feel like you have to give a bunch of options. Just start with a would you rather, right? It makes that choice and giving students choice a little bit more sustainable from a design perspective. And so in your, let's go back to your resource document. In your resource document, I have a blog I've written about kind of the value of replacing, maybe not all, but some exams with performance tasks. I have that would you rather performance task template in there if you want to play with it. And then I also linked to some of Jay McTighe's work on performance tasks, which is really, he's done such a beautiful job creating resources for educators. So in this your turn, what I want you to do is read back through any learning objectives you might have articulated, and then think about, okay, if those are the objectives of the mini unit, what type of performance task might you ask students to do to kind of demonstrate their learning so you can assess whether they learned the content you wanted them to, they mastered the skills you were hoping they would master, and then what are your thoughts on giving them some meaningful choice about how they demonstrate that learning? Do you like this idea of kind of a would you rather approach to the performance task, providing those flexible pathways so hopefully every student has something they feel confident they can do to demonstrate their learning? So I'm going to stop talking. I will open up the chat. I'll answer any questions that landed there. Again, if you want to have a thought partner or brainstorm or run an idea by me, please don't be shy. Throw it in that chat. I'm going to set the timer for 3 minutes so you can just kind of capture your thinking and brainstorms in that assessment column of your curriculum mapping document. All right, I'm going to pull you guys back together. And if you had any kind of assessment strategies, maybe performance task ideas kind of floating around that you kind of captured on your curriculum mapping document in that assessment column, I would love for you to throw it into the chat window just to share in case people were a little stuck, or that way we can kind of benefit from learning with each other. Now, the next column I typically will spend time on when I work with teachers is, so after learning objectives, then you have that instruction and modeling column in your mini unit kind of curriculum mapping template. And in that column, really what we want to ask ourselves is, what information and what models will students need to see or hear in order to make progress toward those kind of firm standardizing goals or learning objectives? So we want to be really nuanced about this, like identifying the specific explanation. So for Catherine's example on the specific subtopic of ratio, what will students need to hear from you or see from you in a model in order to understand how to kind of work with ratios in a particular way? If we're, teaching them coping mechanisms, like what explanations, what models will they need to see in order to be able to take that and kind of put it into practice? So identifying the very specific explanations, instruction, and model that students are going to benefit from in order to make progress. The next thing, as we talk about really kind of thriving in flexible all learning landscapes, is which of these explanations and which of these models might be best presented in a video, and which would be best presented in maybe differentiated small group instruction with the teacher. So one of the things I do a lot around work around is helping teachers to figure out, what are those explanations? What's that instruction? What are those models they can shift into a video format? Because they are going to say the same thing the same way to all students. Because if you're going to say the same thing the same way for everybody, or show them a process in the exact same way, or the exact same model, then those are best captured in video, because what that does is allow students to control the experience. They can pause, they can rewind, they can rewatch that explanation as many times as they need to. Then what are those explanations or models that are really going to benefit from some differentiation? Maybe you're going to explain things differently or use different words or examples as you explain something. Maybe you're going to choose different prompts or problems at different level of academic rigor and complexity based on the group of students you're working with. So to give you an example from my subject area, as an English teacher, I spend a lot of time on writing, right? Most of us, it doesn't matter what discipline you're in, most of us cover some type of writing. And so for me, there were certain explanations like, what is a thesis statement? How do you write one? Where does it belong in your essay? I would basically say that the same way for everybody. And a video also increases accessibility because kids have so much more control over it, because they can add closed captioning. If you host your video on YouTube, they can actually slow down the pace of the video. All of that has a lot of benefits for learners. Whereas if I was trying to get students to understand how to select strong textual evidence, how to analyze and pull apart quotes and write about them, that is much more nuanced. That is going to benefit from being done in small differentiated group instruction, so that I can choose kind of textual evidence at different levels of academic rigor and complexity. I can kind of provide different levels of support. So maybe some students who are starting to try to analyze textual evidence, they need sentence stems, and they're going to need a lot more immediate feedback as they're trying from me, their teacher. And I can't do that in a whole group kind of instructional session. I need to have them in small differentiated groups. So what I would love for you guys to do is on your curriculum mapping document. You have your subtopic, you may have a learning objective or two identified. You might have some ideas about how would I assess the progress toward these learning objectives. Now I want you to go to that second column that says instruction and modeling. And I just want you to brainstorm all of the explanations, the instruction. What concepts are you going to need to explain? What models are you going to need to demonstrate during this mini unit so students can make progress toward these firm standard aligned goals? Once you have a few of those filled in, and try to be as specific as possible, because when we talk about making videos, we always want to keep them short, so we don't want to cover too much ground in a single video. Once you have a collection of instruction and models you know students need, go through and put a V next to any of them that you think you could probably deliver in a video, because you'd probably say the same thing the same way, and students might need to hear that explanation over and over and over again. And it gets really frustrating to have to repeat ourselves and lose those instructional minutes. So label those with a V, meaning that they might make really good videos. Then anything that you're like, I think this would benefit from live instruction, live small group instruction, put a little L next to it. Because as you go through and start putting together the actual content for this unit, you'll know what you might want to try to make a video out of versus what you might want to pull into small group instruction. And again, I'm going to mute myself so I'm not a distraction, start the timer, and just check out the chat window if you have questions, want to brainstorm, ask me about an idea you have, whether something might work better in a video versus small group. All right, I'll mute myself, let you guys work. All right, I'm going to pull you guys back. And another thing, if you are interested in sharing, is you are going through this, if you have one example of a video, kind of an example of what you might put in a video versus something you might put into small kind of differentiated group instruction, because the video is something you'd kind of say the same way versus small group instruction is something you'd want to differentiate or really have more hands-on kind of opportunities to work with students or give them feedback. I would love to have a few of you guys share some just examples. So if anybody was kind of struggling to make that distinction, maybe some of those examples in the chat window will help. All right. Then we have the next column over, the third column over is our activities column. And I like to think of this as like meaning making, right? So when we think about instruction and models, we're really kind of transferring information. We're helping students to understand concepts, strategies, and skills. But then they need time to like process. Sometimes they'll do some individual tasks to try to make sense of what they learned. A lot of times they'll need to kind of bounce ideas off of their peers and their classmates as well to learn, or to really kind of understand and solidify that learning. So there's a lot of different things we might ask learners to do. We could have them engage in discussion, which is actually the strategy I want to like spotlight since we don't have a ton of time together. But I think it's important to dig into at least one of these. We might have them making connections. That might be connections in a piece of writing. It could be connections in a visual kind of display or concept map. Or we might have them kind of taking what they're learning and summarizing it, or even doing kind of like a 3-2-1 reflection where it's like, okay, what are 3 things you learned and 2 connections you made and 1 question you had, or 3 things you learned, 2 questions you had and 1 thing that surprised you, really getting them starting to kind of take that learning and really mentally play with it and try to organize it and make sense of it. Now, I am a huge fan of discussion. I think academic discourse is one of the most powerful strategies we have to connect members of a learning community to make sense of their learning. So whether we are facilitating discussions in person or online or a combination of the two, I think there are just myriad benefits, right? So it's the connection we have to this learning community. It's the opportunity we give students to be exposed to different perspectives and points of view. I mean, we live in a very polarized time, and I think it's important for students to realize having a different perspective is not a bad thing. It actually makes a discussion really rich and interesting if we support our ideas, if we are respectful when we have a different opinion. We can use discussion to drive deeper thinking around topics and texts and issues. And the more kids chat about something, the more likely they are to understand what they're learning, retain what they're learning. If they're communicating in person, they're really practicing those speaking and listening skills. Maybe they're even doing that online with a platform like Flip, where they are recording kind of discussion responses to each other. If they are engaging in your learning management system or your Google Classroom in an online discussion, then they're practicing those writing skills to communicate effectively. And what I like about discussion, if we are doing it online or we're doing it in small groups, is that every student has the opportunity to have their voice heard. And that's just not possible in a whole group teacher-led discussion, which typically is dominated by a select few students. And ultimately, I think the most exciting part of discussion is it really starts to shift students from being these consumers of other people's ideas to producers and generators of their own ideas. So like I said, discussion can happen in class and online. And I'll be frank with you, there are times with my own high school students and even now with my graduate students where I want to engage them in a discussion, but I know that for some students who are shy, they need more time to process, they struggle with social anxiety. Even just a small group discussion that is live might be intimidating. It might present barriers. They might feel more successful logging into a learning management system and posting their ideas in an online discussion. So there would be times when I would say, okay, you can either join 2 small group discussions over on this side of the room, or you can go this side of the room, log into our learning management system and post your response to the question there and reply kind of to other peers who are also engaging online. Because sometimes people are just having a bad day or coming into the classroom with trauma and they just need a little space, and jumping into a live discussion was not going to be the most effective way for them to engage with their peers. So you can kind of decide how you want to approach discussion. But if it happens, if it's a synchronous small group discussion, it's obviously happening in a classroom or in a breakout room. If you have kids online together, it does target that speaking and listening skill, which is so powerful. And it requires that students really focus on developing their facilitation skills as they learn to navigate live conversations with other humans, make connections between different ideas being shared, ask follow-up and clarification questions. Whereas online discussions, those can happen. They can happen in a classroom over the length of a class period. They can happen at different times and at different places if students are working remotely or online. They really target text-based speaking and text-based communication skills if they're happening like in a learning management system, but they can also target those speaking skills if you're using a platform where they are recording responses to questions and responding verbally in recordings to each other. The benefit of that asynchronous approach is it does provide students with a high degree of control over the kind of pace at which they work. Often they can kind of revise their written responses or re-record a response if it didn't go exactly how they were hoping for. So for any teacher who uses online discussions, I included actually, it's kind of almost like a resource document within a resource document, but I think it can be really helpful, which is just like, how do we support dynamic discussions online? And so these tips that I'm about to show you, you guys all have access to here if you want to revisit them or share them with other people that you work with. So everything you're about to see, you have access to on that document as well. But I always encourage teachers, like, you got to hook your students. So if it's an online discussion, let's start with a catchy, creative title. That's really what will draw some of them in. We also want to acknowledge that we have really diverse groups of learners. So let's subtly differentiate with the kinds of questions we're asking. So maybe we start with a more academically challenging question, and then we get kind of subsequently we make the questions more accessible using more simpler vocabulary so that there's more than one entry point into the discussion and all students can participate. I encourage teachers to kind of vary their question types. I'm a big fan of analytical questions as an English teacher, so I really had to push myself to integrate other kinds of questions, compare and contrast, reflection questions, debate questions, so that it always felt kind of fresh and interesting from a student perspective. Inserting media, I think, is absolutely key because we are teaching such a visual generation of students. So whether it's a photograph or a video clip or an infographic or a chart of some kind, something to just grab that visual attention. And then always, always, always including some directions for, hey, once you answer this question, you're not done. You are a member of a discussion. So you need to reply to X number of people. And so one of the things we won't have time for now, but that I'd love for you to think about as you're looking at this mini unit, can you design a discussion question either for small groups or for an online kind of forum that takes some of these tips and puts them into practice and is really designed to drive some higher order thinking around the topic or kind of the subject of your mini lesson? Because again, I think discussion is such a beautiful way to allow students to engage in this meaning-making process together. And then embedding those instructions for participation is key. If we don't say, hey, once you've posted your response, you need to read and respond to at least 2 other students, compliment strong points made, build on ideas shared, ask questions, respectfully disagree. Sometimes it's easy for them to just answer the question and then exit whatever space they're in if it's an online discussion. So being really thoughtful about embedding those, what is expected of you after you answer the question? How many people should you reply to? What are some techniques you can use to make sure you are saying something substantial? Because especially with online discussions, but even in person discussions, they often don't know how to kind of drive conversation forward by sharing a personal experience, connecting an experience they had with something else somebody else shared, or connecting two ideas that were shared that were similar, kind of expanding on somebody's thinking. All of these have to be taught explicitly, but as we invest time as educators in helping students to learn how to engage in a conversation in a really substantive and meaningful way, the more quality, the more depth we're going to observe as we kind of see them engage in these conversations. And it might require some language training wheels, some sentence stems, so that they get comfortable understanding, okay, what does it look like to build on an idea shared? What does it sound like to respectfully disagree with somebody or to complement a specific point another student made? So thinking about the supports and scaffolds that students might need to engage in meaning making via discussion and making sure we have those available to students. If you're going to do small group discussions, which I prefer definitely to the whole group conversation, just because in a whole group conversation, only a handful of students are probably going to have their voices heard. There's not that equity of sharing happening. So I like to kind of, if we're going to do small group discussions, I put a small group in each corner of the classroom. They sit in a circle so they can make eye contact. I often invite them to write some of their own questions, things that they are curious about after watching a video, reading a chapter, conducting a lab, so that they're also adding to the conversation with questions they're interested in and that they care about. And you can even give them some agency about how does each group want to engage in conversation, because there are a bunch of different discussion techniques we might give them to choose from. So I included this discussion techniques choice board in your resource document in case you want to explore some of these, because I've had groups where they'll opt for graffiti team time, where they'll write a question and they actually write responses to questions on paper. And I remember being a little hesitant whether I was going to like this strategy. And I was blown away by how honest and respectful and how in-depth some of these responses to each other in real time, in person, but in writing, really how it drove their conversations forward. So again, it's even thinking about discussion through that lens of student agency. So if you're inspired after we get off the call, because we've got like a minute and a half left, I'd love for you to be thinking about that activities column and brainstorming the kinds of learning activities you think would really help your students to process the information you know you're going to present, whether it's in video or in small group discussion or small group instruction, and maybe even try your hand at writing a sample discussion question that you might post online or on Flip if you're going to use that platform. Or even thinking about those in-person discussion techniques and how you might use them in small groups to facilitate real-time conversations that allow students to choose the discussion technique or pathway that's going to work for them. So I want to thank you guys for coming today. And I just want to let you know there are so many free opportunities for you to continue learning. I would love for you to put a bug in your ear. Any person you work with who you think might enjoy these sessions. I have the pleasure of leading quite a few of them. There's actually more than this, but this is all I could fit on my slide. So if you're curious about instructional delivery across learning environments, assessment and data-driven design, metacognitive skill building, engaging parents and families, I would love to have you join me for a future session. And if you have any questions about today's session, maybe you're implementing something or you're working with your curriculum map and something pops up for you, you can reach me through my website. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Instagram. I'm a little lazy on LinkedIn and Facebook, just to be honest. So definitely Twitter, Instagram, or just posting a question or a comment to my website is probably the best way to get in touch with me. But I want to thank you all for spending an hour with me. It was my pleasure. I'll hang on for a couple of minutes to answer any last questions you might have. And again, have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope to see some of you at the next session.